Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes shall be they of his own household. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it.
Reading from the Scriptures, verse 34, Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to bring division, a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies are those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his stake and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life shall lose it, and he that has lost his life for my sake shall find it. Now, Benner, this is one of those portions that just is a very unpopular text, and that's why I felt like it was probably appropriate, as we're in Matthew's version of the ministry of Messiah, to stay here and just kind of walk on through some of these texts in Matthew.
Absolutely. I think it's good to address it because it is misunderstood. And the other thing is that it is a crucial point that people come to when looking at the Scriptures for what they really say, and the comfortable, being comfortable with what it says based on, affections towards family and friends and things like that.
You bet. I mean, because we've heard it said that Yeshua came to bring peace. And evidently he had heard that too.
Yeah, because what he's doing here is addressing that very thought, that very misunderstanding.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is contrary to what we've heard said. He did not come to bring peace, but a sword. And so just considering the concept of peace, and we know that Yeshua brings peace to those who follow him. He guarantees that, and time again, that I think is misunderstood for a peace and harmony among people.
Right.
There is a peace that we can possess on the inside. It comes from the receiving his Spirit, his set-apart Spirit. There is that peace that's on the inside of us that, in spite of our outward circumstances, we have peace. But it always lines up with what his word says.
Amen.
I've run into too many folks over the years that say that they have peace about this or peace about that, and what they're referring to is in direct opposition to what the Scripture says. I had a lady contact me years and years ago that used to attend here, and she was a pretty naive gal, and she was a pretty lady, and she contacted me once and asked me if I thought it would be the will of, she said, God, that I would, or that she would be a stripper, a dancer in a strip club, because she could then use her body to, attract men to, she said, Jesus. And I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. That's not a tactic that we see employed through the Scriptures.
Right.
And I don't think that, but she said, I have peace about it. And I thought right then, you have something, but you don't have the peace from Yahweh the Father. You have a contrived peace. And I began to consider that whole concept at that point. Where does that kind of peace come from? Let's look at just look at a couple of texts here and get an idea, kind of get a feel for a comparison to the peace that comes from walking with Yeshua as something that is called peace or feels like peace for those who are not walking with Yeshua. The first place I want to look at is in John chapter 14, verse 27. Now, let's back up a couple of verses there. In verse, let's say, verse 24, Yeshua speaking, He who does not love me does not guard my words. And the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father who sent me. These words I have spoken to you while still with you. But the Helper, the set-apart Spirit, whom the Father shall send in my name, he shall teach you all and remind you of all that I said to you. And then in verse 27, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. So here we see a comparison that there's a peace that comes from Yeshua, and there's this what seems to be a peace that comes from the world.
Right.
What's the basis? What in a worldly mindset, what would it be that would bring a pseudo peace? Let's refer to it as that when it's not the true peace of Yeshua. What would bring a pseudo peace to a person that is trying to find reason for doing or not doing, for existing in this circumstance, and they're trying to justify being in that circumstance, saying they have peace?
Well, you know, as I consider that, if you have peace about something that it violates the commandments of Yahweh, you say you have peace about that, you have peace with some entity. In essence, is what you have. And that entity is not in opposition to what you want to do, but it is in opposition to Yahweh. So there's where the rub enters in. So you have peace with this entity that is in opposition to the one that you say that you're having peace with, Yahweh Elohim, and it can't be.
No, it can't. Just like having the peace that can come from Yeshua by walking with him.
Right.
Walking with another entity will cause some kind of pseudo-harmony, feeling, maybe a pseudo-peace of some kind. And I think the world has things to offer that cause people who are not trying to follow Yeshua as much as they're trying to follow their own desires and maybe the ways of the world. And so they're granted this pseudo-peace kind of concept. And Yeshua actually addresses that, I believe, in Luke, his version of the ministry of Yeshua, Luke chapter 12, where Yeshua shares a parable with his taught ones. And in verse 16 it says, the land of a certain rich man yielded well. It was prosperous. And he was reasoning within himself, saying, what shall I do? Because I have no room to store my crops. And he said, I'm going to do this. Pull down my storehouses and build greater. Store all my crops and my goods there. Then say to myself, life, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, rejoice. So here we have, I believe, an example of a guy that is not having the peace that comes from Yahweh, but is having a security, a peace that comes from the world, the prosperity of the world. This guy's testimony here is that he has many goods, in verse 19, that he can lay up for years. In other words, he might be called maybe a prepper. I don't want to step on people's toes, but there are people that actually trust more in their preparation than they do in the one who created the universe. And so it's I think important for us to mention, be wise in your prepping as to who you're really walking in his peace or in his provision, or walking in the world's peace and its provision. And so he says, this person also, take ease. You have plenty to eat. You have plenty to drink. You can actually even rejoice because you don't have to worry about a thing. But look at what verse 20 says. Elohim says to him, you mindless one, this night your life shall be demanded from you, and who shall own what you have prepared? And then in verse 21, so is he who is storing up treasure for himself and is not rich toward Elohim. I think there again is a comparison of that which brings peace by walking according to being rich toward Elohim, the peace of Yeshua, as compared to walking according to the preparations, the blessings, so to speak, the things that would bring security and ease and comfort according to this world.
This is one of those places where the whole premise of what we're doing with this show, you've heard it said, comes into play. Because it says in verse 17, he thought within himself.
Yep.
So he's thinking within himself, I see what I see, it looks really good. And he doesn't know, I'm assuming from what we see here, he obviously either doesn't know or doesn't believe the promises of Elohim.
That's right.
And so that leaves him open to the enemy and his suggestions of saying, yeah, you're right. You do have what you need. Go ahead and build that barn. Everything's fine. Don't worry about a thing, when Yahweh's message is totally different.
It is, because he's dealing on a different scale.
Mm-hmm.
He's not just dealing on the minute scale,
Mm-hmm.
or the hour or the day or the month
Right.
or the year. He's dealing on an eternal
Exactly.
scale. So he's proving what is inside the heart of a person, not just to get by today,
Mm-hmm.
but to actually get through this life walking in harmony with his
Mm-hmm.
son, Yeshua Messiah.
Well, we as individuals, that's one of our biggest struggles, is living in the minute, because we see the problem right in front of us, and we've got to find a way to overcome that, rather than backing up and saying, our Father in heaven, Yahweh, is not surprised by that problem, and in fact, he has the way through it, around it, over it, under it, whatever it is, and it may not be my understanding of how that is, but he sees what's past that.
That's right.
And I don't.
That's right. And too often we make decisions based on that very limited, knowledge. It's also amazing to me, though, the opposite is true, Banner. I've seen people that have, I'll ask them, do you trust Yahweh? Do you trust his son, Yeshua Messiah? Oh, yeah, I trust him with my soul. I trust him with my life. I trust him. Well, then I ask them, do you trust him to get the car payment?
Mm-hmm.
Do you trust him to get you through this day? Do you trust him to provide and fulfill his promises to you, to not worry?
Right.
And then you see a kind of a stymied look on a person's face, like, it's always amazing to me that they can trust Yahweh for eternity that they can't
Right.
see, but they have a real difficult time trusting him for those things that they can see. So Yahweh isn't limited by either circumstance.
Exactly.
He's dealing with the hearts of men and women at whatever age, to bring each of us to a place of fruition to prove who we really trust in.
Exactly. It's that, that we talked about, I believe, last week, that mutual introduction where he knows us and we know him according to what is written. And once we have that kind of knowledge of him, and that he knows us in that same way, then we're able to look at our own lives in the light of that truth, and to be able to make those decisions trusting him, rather than looking to our own opportunities or resources, or our own thoughts.
Yeah. And this really just goes back to the Torah, what we've been talking about all along. A verse in the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 19 says, "And it shall be, when he hears the words of this curse," and the curse is in reference to those who are serving idolatrous and bitterness, that he should bless himself in his heart, saying, I have peace, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, in order to add drunkenness to thirst. In other words, the scripture here is saying the person actually cries out and says, I have peace, even though I'm stubborn in it and I'm not submitted to Yahweh and his word, but I feel like I have peace about this.
Yeah.
It can't come. That peace cannot come from disobedience. That peace comes from, like you've said already, being in harmony with all the entities, the spiritual forces of evil and darkness that are in opposition, in stubbornness against the creator of the universe. So there is this pseudo-peace. And that's why Yeshua said, not the peace that the world gives, but my peace I give to you. There's coming a time when the world will say, for example, in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 3, peace and safety. And Shaul writes there in verse 3, then suddenly destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. So they're going to say there's going to be a time that's coming where we're peaceful. It's peaceful. It's secure. Now, right now in America, it's anything but peaceful. But what if the cry is not to have attained from having attained peace and security, but what if the cry of peace and safety is one to try and attain peace and safety? That it hasn't been accomplished yet, but it's a cry, and it's a universal cry, let's say, of the people in this country. Peace and safety. That's all we want. That's all we need. That's all. When the Prince of Peace is knocking at the door, and they're not answering the door.
Exactly.
When the one who came to bring them true peace is the very one that they've rejected. They've either, relabeled him or recharacterized him or made him somebody else other than who he says he is in his word, and they're not having this true peace that comes from him, or they've rejected him altogether. But what if that cry of peace and safety or peace and security is the universal cry of the people who are supposed representatives of the Prince of Peace, and they don't have any themselves, but they have a good front. They have a good facade that they can put up. They have a good act that they can, walk in. Because honestly, from my experience, I've walked on both sides knowingly now of lawlessness and obedience to his law. And the peace that I tried to contrive while I was walking in lawlessness does not compare to the peace that comes from him by the desire that I have to walk according to his purposes.
And thinking about what you just said, at that time, there was a struggle going on because the inward part of me that was born again was in a place where I knew some peace from him, but I had this struggle because there was a part of me that was unsubmitted, or the lawlessness in me that was finding peace with the world, and so they were at enmity with one another, and there was a struggle going on. So that means it's very important to be able to discern the voices that we're hearing and the peace that's being offered.
You bet. That's why he promises, my sheep hear my voice, that he will give his spirit to those who desire to walk according to his purpose, to cause us, to empower us to walk in obedience, not in lawlessness. And so as we yield to the promptings of his spirit, Hebrews says we are actually exercising our discernment of what is good as opposed to what is evil.
Amen.
I suggest that the peace that the world gives is evil.
Amen.
The peace that Yeshua gives is good.
Amen.
And it's a sad thing when people who are professing believers do not know the difference. They're living, making decisions, pursuing interests, etc., that are in direct opposition to his word, but trying to convince themselves that they have peace about it.
Amen.
What a sad plight.
It is very sad, because the reality is, if we truly have peace with Yahweh and his son Yeshua, we're not going to have peace with the world.
No.
It's not going to happen. And if we have this total peace with the world and we're not hearing his voice, we're not going to have peace with him. It really is an either or, isn't it?
It really is. There's no gray area in that. So now back in Matthew chapter 10, Yeshua says in verse 34, I did not come to bring peace but a sword. And then in verse 35 he says, I have come to bring division. You've heard it said, I've heard it said, that Yeshua and the presence of Yeshua always brings unity.
Wow. Yeah, but that's not the case.
Well, that's not even what he says.
And we've experienced that, so we can know that's true. But even if we hadn't experienced it, he said it. That's the bottom line, isn't it?
Yeah.
It comes down to he said it.
What does he say about it? I mean, Luke, again, the confirmation of that very verse, do not think in verse 51 of Luke chapter 12, do not think that I came to give peace on earth. I say to you, no, but rather division. And there in Luke's gospel, he says, from now on, 5 in one house shall be divided, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. Father shall be divided against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and on and on and on and on. But that's exactly what was prophesied through the prophets. Micah chapter 7 verse 6 says, for son is despising father, daughter rises up against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. The enemies of a man are the men of his own house.
Wow. Now, that's not popular stuff.
No, that's usually a deal breaker.
Yeah.
When you start saying, listen, your walk with Yeshua might cause you to be at odds with your parents. Oh, it can't be true then. Or your walk with Yeshua might cause you to be at odds with your spouse. Oh, it can't be true. Or your walk with Yeshua might cause you to be at odds with, your son or your daughter. What is Yeshua saying? He says, a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are those of his own household.
Exactly.
How much clearer does it have to get? So there's also, I believe, not only a pseudo peace that's offered by the world, but there's a pseudo harmony, a pseudo unity, so to speak. And we've seen that. We've seen it at times in smaller kinds of circumstances and situations, but I think it's going to be huge. I think there's going to be a unified effort against those who actually believe the scriptures from Genesis through Revelation are relevant for the professing believer today. I think that's one of the very things that's going to bring about the persecution in the last days of those who actually are embracing Yeshua and holding to the commands.
Yeah, exactly, because it has to come down to all of those that are opposed to the truth finally finding that unity and that purpose to oppose the truth. There are many factions of those, but we already see this coming to pass where these factions are finding the common ground to come together against the pure truth of Elohim.
Oh, it's amazing. It really is. In John chapter 6, Yeshua gives several very hard to understand and actually embrace statements. In John 6, verse, let's see. Let's take, backing up here. I want to start in an appropriate place so I'm not, just rambling on here. But talking about the concept of those who feed on Yeshua. In verse 55, Yeshua speaking, "For my flesh is truly food, my blood is truly drink." Verse 56, "He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood stays in me, and I in him." What? I mean, you're following this guy along, and all of a sudden he makes a statement like that, and the first thing you're thinking of is, he's talking about cannibalism. We're going to literally eat his flesh and literally drink his blood? And that caused division, because in verse 66, it says, "From then on, many of his taught ones withdrew and were not walking with him anymore." He turns to his disciples, said, "Do you also wish to go away?" And Peter, Shimon Kepha, says, "Master, to whom shall we go? You possess words of everlasting life."
Amen.
So the concept here that I'm simply drawing on is there are times when what Yeshua says and requires of his taught ones is going to bring division, even among taught ones. Not just those of your family that might not be believers, but those of the family or professing the family of the body of Messiah, where they say, that's too far.
Yeah.
I am not going any further. I'm not going to die to myself. I'm not going to yield to myself. I'm not going to let the dead bury the dead. I'm not going to, this or that, and they go another direction. There is that division that Yeshua is referring to in Matthew chapter 10.
So it comes down to the reality of it. It's the word that brings division, because at the very core of what the truth is, it divides itself or separates itself from the lie.
It does.
And so when you have people who fall down either on the side of having a heart to know and walk in the truth versus those who do not have that desire, then there comes the division between people, even family.
You bet. Then you have another division, and that would be between the truth and the perceived truth, which would be bad theology. The truth being good theology, accurate theology, the study of Yahweh himself, based on the word of Yahweh himself, as compared to bad theology, which takes a little bit of the word of Yahweh and then adds to it, like we've been saying, or subtracts from it, and comes up with its own version of Yahweh.
So now there are people, though, who say, well, you're just majoring on the minors. How many times have we heard that said? But those minors, many of those minors are actually detracting from the truth and creating what is essentially a lie.
Yeah, it's the little things that add up to the big thing. It's, for example, just to address that quickly, the reason the listener is where they are today is not by one huge decision. It's by a series of small decisions, minor decisions. I think I'll turn the radio on. There's a decision. I think I'll listen to what these guys are saying. There's a decision. I think I don't want to hear what these guys are saying. There's another decision. All those little decisions matter as they're compared to the whole, the result of those little decisions. So yeah, majoring on the minors, little decision, maybe equating those to things that are, insignificant, that's not wise. It's the little things that actually add up to the larger things.
In both expressions, the little decisions we make are either progressing us along the path of truth and righteousness, or they're progressing us along the path of lie and condemnation.
That's right. And so, good theology. Look at this story here we're back in John chapter 7. And starting in verse 40, it says, "Many from the crowd, when they heard the word, then said, 'This truly is the prophet.'" Now, many people say that in the crowd. Verse 41, "Others said, 'This is the Messiah.' But others said, 'Does the Messiah come out of Galilee?'"
Mm-hmm.
So they think they know where he's from.
Right.
They think they know his origin. And based on what they think they know, they make a decision or a question here, a rhetorical question, that is in error.
Mm-hmm.
But look in verse 42. "Did not the Scripture say that the Messiah comes from the seed of David, and from the village of Bethlehem, where David was?"
Mm-hmm.
He was. Yeshua was from there. He was from both of that. He was from the seed. They didn't want to recognize it. So you've got people that actually are saying he's the prophet. You've got people that are saying he's the Messiah, the anointed one. You've got people that are saying, no, he can't be because of his origin. There's a division there. And that's what verse 43 says. So a division came about among the people because of him. You're going to have that. You're going to have people with their prejudice or their personal bias think that they know more about what Yeshua said than what Yeshua said.
Exactly.
And they're going to base decisions on that. In the future here, we're going to look at Acts chapter 10 about Peter's or Cephas' vision, which has, a sad commentary today, a sad application among traditionalists today, because they've put words in Peter's mouth that Peter didn't say.
Right.
It's another one of those things. You've heard it said, but wait a minute, who said it? Did Cephas say it, or did I say it? Did you say it, or is that what our movement says? Is that what our denomination, or is that what the pastor says that he says? Let's see what he says. That's what we're trying to challenge people to do is, listen, you've heard it said this. You've heard that Yeshua brings nothing but peace. You've heard that Yeshua brings nothing but unity, when in fact Yeshua's own words in Matthew 10 says the opposite.
Amen.